My name's Elise Favrica. As some of you may know, I see a good amount of familiar faces, but as I always say, I always like seeing unfamiliar ones because that means I haven't met most of you before. So I'm really, really excited to be welcoming you to tonight's event. Yeah, feel free to, no, it's fine. We're all friends here. Tonight's event, Tales from the Trails. So as you know, this is a panel of young alums who were involved in 2018 campaigns in the media. And I can't take credit for planning this entirely on my own. In fact, I was not able to participate in planning it this much. So thank you to the Young Alum Committee for putting this together. But this event particularly means a lot to me because as an economics senior major, writing my thesis that year, I became especially intrigued by and especially frustrated with the increasingly bipartisan nature that seems to define our political system. And that was over 6 years ago. So we all know things have gotten a little more extreme since then. But due partially to a taste or distaste for bipartisan politics, I found myself often avoiding reading news stories about politicians or politics as much as I was reading stories about policies. I assumed that was fine because when the election came around, I'd do what I thought was sufficient amount of research looking at who supported what policies, and I'd vote that way. What I've learned in the last 2 years is that that just quite frankly was doing me a major disservice, and that nowadays it's not that simple. We can't just be passive consumers of media and information anymore. And because of that, the media matters even more nowadays today. And given that, I can personally say I'm very comforted to know that Barnard alums make up many of the people in various newsrooms, news organizations, whatever area of media, to help make sure that we stay as educated. You know, we see a lot of manipulation and headlines and stuff across both sides of the aisle. So thanks to these women so much for coming and speaking to us. And without further ado, I'll let y'all introduce yourselves.
Thanks. I'm Cassie Spodak. I am moderating the panel today. I graduated from Barnard in 2009, and I started working at CNN just after that, the fall after. And at CNN, I've worked basically on all sides of production, on TV, digital, news gathering. I covered politics for 4 years now. I covered the Obama White House, and I covered the 2016 election as what we call an embed, where you are basically embedded on the campaign trail. So I lived in New Hampshire, covering the presidential primaries there, and covered basically almost every single presidential candidate. And then I was on the road until the election, and I was on the plane with Mike Pence after he became the vice presidential nominee. And then right before the election, I joined our digital side, and I now work with digital video, which is basically all the video clips you see on CNN.com that are not straight from our air or from TV. So we do breaking news, we do feature videos, and with the 2018 midterms, I was able to travel around the country and cover congressional races and do a lot of great stuff. And so I'm really excited to moderate this panel. I love that we have a really diverse group of voices here from podcasts and radio and TV and print and video. And so I'm really excited to hear from you guys. Meg, do you want to?
Sure. My name is Meg Kelly. I graduated in 2009. I currently work on the fact checker at the Washington Post. So my role is sort of interesting in that I produce video for the fact checker, but I also report for the fact checker. Before that, I covered the 2016 election as a visual producer for NPR, where I did everything from fly around and follow Bernie Sanders to make videos with Ron Elving of him explaining what on earth politics is. Yeah, and I had a sort of twisty path to get there in the first place. I studied architecture here and spent some time in India making documentaries, which is how I kind of found my way to journalism.
I'm Jess Miller. I also graduated in 2009. For the past 4 years, I've been a producer at WNYC. And for the past 2 years or so, I've worked in the newsroom on our narrative journalism team, which makes the podcasts The United States of Anxiety. It made a podcast called Caught about the juvenile justice system. But in my capacity as a politics reporter, mostly for the United States of Anxiety. And we just finished our 3rd season, which looked at issues of gender and power leading up to the midterm elections.
Hi, I'm Maggie Astor. I graduated in 2011. I have worked at the New York Times pretty much since graduation. I started as a copy editor and was there for about 5 years. I was a copy editor during the 2016 campaign and edited a lot of the political coverage then. After that, I became a reporter, and earlier this year, I joined the politics team covering the midterm elections and all the various candidates and issues involved there. I've been traveling around the country reporting on candidates and policies and voters, and now we're just gearing up for 2020, and I'll be covering that.
Hi, I'm Theo Balcomb. I'm also class of 2009, and I'm also at the New York Times. I started my career in radio at NPR right after I was graduated. I worked there for about 8 years and then came to the Times to launch a podcast called The Daily, and I'm the managing producer of that.
Hey, I'm Rachael Dottle. I graduated from Barnard in 2016 and Columbia in 2018. I work at FiveThirtyEight as a visual journalist. Before that, which is actually my first journalism job. Before that, I was working at the MTA, the Department of Subways. Yeah. I studied urban studies and architecture at Barnard, and at FiveThirtyEight, we do a lot of data-driven reporting and analysis, and so I do a lot of the data analysis and building the graphics that we have for our election, including the forecast projects that we published. We forecasted the House, the governor's races, and also the Senate, so I worked on all of those, as well as our night of election night. We have kind of a forecast that we had updating, and we do a lot of coverage around that. That's what I do.
Cool. Thank you, guys. So, Jas, I think I wanted to start with you talking about the United States of Anxiety. When we talked about it, you talked about how you guys came up with the theme for this episode or this season, looking at gender and power. And that was before it had become kind of such a focal issue of the midterms this year. How did you guys come up with that? And then how did that evolve as you had the Kavanaugh hearings and then kind of what we saw happen on Election Day?
We knew we wanted to talk about gender and power because the Me Too conversation had already started, and because in season 2 of our podcast, we really felt off the news. We did a season that was about culture warriors that sort of pushed the ideas that we now all live and believe with and vote with. But it was more of a historic thing than like a daily headline kind of a podcast. And we wanted to do something that sort of merged the two. So that topic in particular was in the zeitgeist, but it also, we were able to blend our two things we love to do, our history and our headlines. That said, we worked all spring and summer to do these beautiful historic pieces, and then we get to launch week and the Kavanaugh hearings start. So we really had to rush to change the plan to not sound like we were like back in history. And luckily though, we're planning to, in our first 2 episodes, do a piece about the Anita Hill hearings, about how history repeats itself. So history repeated itself, it was kind of perfect. But we also were able to have all of these back interviews that really were able to like highlight how we got here. Like I interviewed 10 women who had served in the US Senate. In all of history, I don't know what the count is post midterms, but prior to now, only 52 women have served in the Senate, opposed to like 2,000 men almost. Mm-hmm. So 37 of those women were alive. I decided to call all of them, and 10 of them talked to me. But the things they told me were really shocking. You think of these women who were in high positions of power, but these are women who were told on the campaign to not be women. Like Patty Murray, the senator from Washington, she was elected in the first year of the women in 1992. She was told to not use the name Patty because people would think of her as a woman. And she was like, cool, well, I am one. And she ended up winning her campaign, calling herself the mom in tennis shoes. So it was cool to see those stories kind of like coming back in 2018.
Cool. And one other thing I thought was interesting that we talked about before was that you also were on the ground talking to voters and to people outside of kind of the DC and New York bubbles that a lot of media people work in. How important was that to the stories that you were working on and how you told your stories?
I think that's very important to the work that we do on our show. We don't like to talk to a lot of talking heads. We like to talk to people on the ground. I think the one thing that was really, one of the first things we did was Kai Wright, our host, and I went out to the suburbs of Pittsburgh during the Connor Lamb special election. That was our first sort of like getting out and reporting for this season of the show. And we went to a Trump rally. We didn't quite know what to expect. I'd never been to a Trump rally before. Neither had Kai. We talked to people waiting in line there. It was an interesting experience. They were open to talking to us, but everybody was really fired up. There was, if you just dug a little bit, you got to anger, which was, I think, illustrative in many ways. And then we went and knocked on doors in sort of like the working class neighborhood around where the Trump rally was held. And Kai and I talked about how many women opened the doors and their husbands would be like, oh, you don't want to talk to her. Or the wife would be like, oh, he's the political one. Like, these women didn't feel like they had a right to an opinion. And I think that was also very surprising to me.
Did any of you guys, other people on the panel, have experiences on the ground or any kind of interactions, I guess, that influenced the way you reported later on?
Yeah, absolutely. I've spent a lot of time in the past few months in some pretty rural states. I did some reporting in Idaho, in North Dakota, and in some rural parts of other states. And, you know, I think that sometimes when we talk about going out and talking to voters and getting out of the coastal bubble, we think about it in this very simplistic way of just, you know, getting the opposing perspective, getting the conservative perspective. And what I actually found when I was in these places was how much the things that people wanted to talk about were not the issues that are held up nationally as hot buttons. You know, I went to Iowa. I went to churches. I talked to some, you know, deeply religious voters, and not a single one of them mentioned, you know, any of the issues that we might think they would. You know, abortion, social issues, all that. They all talked about farming and how Trump's tariffs were affecting them. And, you know, I think the problem with the media bubble is not so much liberal versus conservative as just a very simplistic conception of the range of issues that people are concerned with. And so getting out and talking to voters really helped me, not from the perspective of, oh, talking to Republicans, but just from the perspective of seeing what issues people were actually voting on and actually talking about and actually disagreeing on.
Yeah, and that actually gets me to my next question, which I was going to ask you, which is about balancing our coverage of the horse race and then also policy issues, which I think is something the media always kind of plays around with. I mean, and for anyone who doesn't know, the horse race kind of refers to polling and prediction models and internal campaign dynamics and field operations, stuff that I think political reporters rightly spend a lot of time on, but that, as we're hearing, like voters on the ground outside of cities really aren't thinking about. How important do you think that is? And I guess also with the 2018 midterms, thinking about like the expectations that were set with all this talk about the blue wave, and then how that kind of affects what actually happens on election day and how we cover that.
Yeah, I've really done very little horse race reporting myself. Pretty much all of the coverage I've done has been focused on It's been focused on policy, it's been focused on voters, it's been focused on the experiences that candidates are having on the trail. Like I wrote one story about the harassment that this wave of women running for office were experiencing. So the division is not just, horse race versus policy, but horse race versus the whole array of issues and experiences out on the trail. And it's not that I don't think that horse race reporting is important. People need to know what the general tilt of the country is at any given time. There can be internal campaign dynamics that are very relevant to how we perceive candidates and candidates' fitness for office. But I think that, as many journalists would say, we focus too much on the horse race. And what you said about, the expectations that were set, one of the things that I found really remarkable on election night and in the days that followed was the way in which, even though Democrats had a really excellent night, picking up almost 40 House seats, picking up a number of governorships, picking up state legislative seats, really limiting their losses in the Senate on a map that was just absolutely horrendous for Democrats. It was really a fantastic night, but it didn't meet this sort of preconceived notion of the blue wave, which was that, Democrats were magically going to overcome the map and retake the Senate because the wave was just going to be that powerful and they were going to gain, 60 seats in the House, even though a lot of states are so gerrymandered that they, can't win. And so in the middle of election night, we had, people on TV, James Carville, saying, oh, well, looks like it's not going to be a blue wave because certain swing races did not just fall immediately for Democrats. And I think that does a disservice to readers and to voters to create this narrative that is essentially all or nothing. And it's not, it's not doing anybody any favors when the narrative that was built up before the election actually influences the way that people perceive the basic objective facts of election night. So that was really remarkable to me.
Yeah, I've always thought it was really interesting that when operatives would tell me that winning elections can be just as much about setting expectations as it is about actually winning an election, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Theo, I had a question for you on kind of a different topic, but I think what your podcast does is it speaks to a very kind of specific audience. And one of the podcast that I listened to was about Missouri. You guys went to Missouri and you had 2 episodes there. Missouri is an incredibly important state in the midterms. There were a lot of competitive elections there. How did you guys think about doing that in kind of a different way? Yeah. I thought it was really creative the way you told those stories.
So that story started back almost a year ago when we found out that there was one clinic that performed abortions in the state of Kentucky. There was only one clinic remaining. And we did a story about that and what happened outside that clinic and how it operated and the people who worked there. It turns out there's one doctor who's worked there for like 30 years and how difficult it is to keep coming to work every day when you think, okay, today could be the day that we are no longer open. Turns out it's not just Kentucky. There's actually way more states that only have one clinic that perform abortions, and one of them is in fact Missouri, which was shocking to me. So we decided that Missouri was just this place that we should go to. And so our reporter, Sabrina Tavernisi, and a producer on our team, Lindsay Garrison, decided to go out and do this reporting and found all of these intricacies around Claire McCaskill and how people were thinking about it and what it means for the Democratic Party as a whole. Because what does it mean to be, potentially somebody who's not as pro-choice as the Democratic Party wants you to be? And how can you talk about that to your constituents? And how complicated that is? And in the end, how difficult it was for her to actually win election, right? Because she ended up losing her seat. So for us, it was grounded in this idea of abortion and how to figure that out in the grander Democratic Party. But kind of as Maggie's saying, without saying, okay, we're going to cover the horse race of this, which Democrats where, we're going to go to one place, to one person, and to figure out the intricacies of that in a really deep way. And that's what works out for us. When we think about horse race versus policy, it's not particularly interesting to have an entire episode of The Daily devoted to what are the numbers and what do they say? No offense to my neighbor to the right. FiveThirtyEight does a wonderful job of that. For us, we're much more interested in how can we take you to a place, get you really attached to those people, and that I think is going to be much more informative for our medium, and you can get all of your amazing horse race and numbers coverage from FiveThirtyEight.
Just to chime in, I also think a big problem with the horse race mentality is that it sort of creates the idea that the only candidates worth covering are the ones who are going to win or who have a chance of winning, when even candidates who have absolutely no chance to win at all, could, the fact that they're doing maybe better than expected, or just the issues that they're raising, the way voters are responding to them, can reveal a lot about where the electorate is and trends in the country. I covered the Democratic candidate for governor in Idaho, Paulette Jordan. And as a Democrat in Idaho, obviously she wasn't going to win. But she was doing a lot better than a Democrat, quote unquote, ought to be in Idaho. And voters were really responding to this very eclectic message that she had. She also would have been the first Native American governor of any state. So even though she had no chance of winning, she said things about the electorate that were worth talking about. And at its worst, the horse race mentality can sort of prevent us from looking at those insights.
And we saw a number of candidates win their primaries that no one thought should have. So, and Meg, so I have a question for you about the fact-checking column, which started in 2008 under Bush.
Yeah.
So a lot has changed since then.
It's been a while.
I saw a column you guys did recently where you said that Trump made 6,420 false or misleading claims over 649 days, which is the beginning of his administration. Keeps you guys very busy. But one question I had was about looking for the balance in how you cover Trump and then also how you pick topics, because I know you guys try to be bipartisan in how you fact check things.
That's a really good question. Mm-hmm. So the president talks a lot, mm-hmm. and in our database, we track every false or misleading claim that he says. So we spend a lot of time reading.
Wait, every single one?
Every single one, all of them.
Wow.
Yeah, he's crossed 7,000 by now. Updates coming at the end of the year. We just need a little sleep.
Whoa.
But I think, so our bar is sort of like, the database exists in order to take care of sort of the obvious, run-of-the-mill, it takes me 2 seconds to Google this to know that it's false fact checks. For the column, we try to think about it something that's going to need more context or more explaining or more history. Maybe it's a trend. I wrote something earlier this week that was about the way the president was talking about minorities. And it brought together sort of different statistics that he'd been using. So homeownership and unemployment, and that sort of allowed us to kind of get at a bigger narrative that he was trying to create. But we spend a lot of time searching for Democrats, honestly, and are always happy when readers send us things. Because pre the Trump era, the column was very 50-50. There was, 50% Republicans that were fact-checked and 50% Democrats. And it's my boss's constant anxiety about the lack of balance that we have. So we spend a lot of time trying to get around fact-checking the president while also reading everything he says.
So that brings me to another issue that I think I've talked about with almost all of you, about the way that the president dominates the news cycle, and that whether it's good or bad, he's happy when the news cycle is about him. And we saw that and the effect on the midterms with how he talked about the caravan. And I'm wondering, when you guys think about an issue like that that's really dominating everything, how do you think about a creative way of covering it, adding something new? How do you wrestle with that? And if anyone wants to jump in.
So when this first came up, we had a vigorous debate about it we had an editorial meeting every morning, and I think some of the members of the team thought this is a narrative created by the president. It is not actually grounded in the facts that he is presenting, so why do we need to be covering it? Was one camp. The other camp was, this is in the news, the facts are not being presented appropriately, not everyone is reading Meg's work as they should, and we should explain what is actually happening. So I was in the second camp, and we went with the second camp. And we ended up doing a story about traveling with a group of people in this migrant group, which ends up being really not that much of a group, in fact, right? It's thousands of people, but they're all kind of dispersed. And so one of our reporters had been traveling with some of these people, and we checked in with her along the way. So we sort of saw her in the morning, we saw her in the afternoon, saw her in the evening, and we interspersed it with what was going on Fox News. So at the top you heard, migrants streaming into the United States, beware. And then you would hear kind of our reporter walking with, a group of kids and their parents, or talking about a man who was trying so desperately to get to the States that he fell off a truck and died. Like you would hear the kind of bombast with what was happening on the ground. So that's how we decided to do it, and we did get flack for it. We definitely got people emailing us, tweeting us, saying, you shouldn't have done this, you're amplifying something that shouldn't be amplified, you're playing into their playbook. We get a lot of those kind of angry liberal emails, for sure. And that was really the only time that we did it. Like, I feel like we needed to set down a marker and say, these are the facts as we know them to be true, and then we kind of moved on.
We did something similar. We sort of like went micro almost. Yeah. So the very first video that Representative Matt Gaetz tweeted and then the president retweeted, I actually fact-checked the video to prove that what he was suggesting about it was like incorrect. So we found the place where the video was actually shot, which wasn't where he said it was. We figured out who the activists were that had initially sort of started it and sort of traced back the whole story to be able to put that video in context of a different video to show sort of like how misleading the whole situation was. And then we went with sort of standard roundups after that. Yeah. But
Rachael, I want to get to you and talk about some of the visualizations that you guys have done, because I think they're really powerful and have a way of cutting through a lot of stuff. I don't know if we can put up the graphics that she has. There we go. So I picked out two graphics that Rachael had sent me that looked at two really big issues in this midterms: the female candidates running, and then there was another one showing turnout here. Yeah. So I just thought these were really great because in pretty simple ways, because I felt like I understood these like pretty quickly looking at them, you really show like a lot of data in one place. And I wanted to ask you like kind of how you thought about producing these and what was your process?
Sure. So actually, both of these graphics we ran and I worked on prior to the election, and with the idea that we could update them after the election. So the women candidates bar chart, which was the first one, we kind of worked with this the Center for American Women in Politics. I didn't want to get that wrong. And they had this data set that they had already kind of set up, and so I worked with another writer, and we were kind of like thinking of ways that we could use this data because it was already giving us like a pretty powerful message based on stuff that we had that didn't need to go, that basically could give an idea of how much of an outlier 2018 is, even before the election was over. So this graphic went with a story with one of my coworkers. She kind of reported out and was speaking to some of the candidates and like looking at, a kind of more traditionally reported piece, and I was supplementing her, which is something we do at 538 a lot, is we might have a writer or a reporter who does something on the ground and like goes and talks to candidates to kind of like get a data point with a data set that we're using, just to qualify both of those. So we have something that's a little bit anecdotal, maybe about one female candidate who is running in a certain district or something like that. And then we'll have a data set that kind of like supports or looks at a broader view. For example, this is since 1974, the number of female candidates who ran for office and won. So we kind of are able to tell a powerful message using data, but also being able to kind of keep it grounded in real stories and not just make it feel abstract and something that you can't relate to. And then the other one is voter turnout, which I kind of wanted to, I ran a different version of this chart right before the election, and that included presidential years as well. So we were kind of comparing before we actually had 2018 data, we just kind of like showed the layout of how presidential elections are different from midterms, in that there's much lower turnout in midterms, already knowing that there was this narrative being built up that there could be a much higher voter turnout this year, just because people are fired up about a lot of things, and there are various reasons. There was this media expectation that there was going to be voter turnout, like a higher voter turnout. So we already had this kind of narrative that was established. So I just made some quick maps, nice little cute ones, and then right after, sorry, right, I thought they were cute. Right after, this is data from the U.S. Elections Project, which published projected, so this is not like finalized results, but it published projected data based on the share of turnout for each state right after the election. So we were able to kind of turn this map around pretty quickly, and it went in a story that I worked on with a couple other coworkers, which included that updated bar chart with the female candidates. It was kind of like a look at the midterm election reaction in 4 charts right after, which is something that's we like to do, is like use the data and just kind of give people clear messages and try and make things accessible and not, while kind of telling a story. So those 2 charts.
What's going on in Minnesota?
You know, I was wondering that because earlier I was reading a piece about how high Minnesota's voter turnout is in general, and I think it might have been, I don't want to give some false stats, but it was around 70% for presidential elections. But so Minnesota generally has pretty high turnout, but I think it's super interesting. I don't know what's going on, but I want to know.
Actually, Maggie can go there.
Yeah, maybe
Maggie knows.
No, actually, right after the election, I did an article on turnout and spoke to a professor at the University of Florida, I believe, about the turnout, and he basically said that turnout in general tends to be higher in states that are very highly educated, states that are majority white, states, you know, there are all sorts of factors, racial, economic, you know, the division of the state between rural and urban. And he said that in Minnesota and in the upper Midwest in general, all of these factors sort of come together. You know, these states are very, very white. A lot of them are very highly educated, in terms of college graduation rates, and
tend to be a bit swingier and flexible in terms of their voting patterns, right?
Yeah, exactly. So so those were the factors that he mentioned. I'm sure there are also others, but I think those things definitely play a role.
For sure.
And so one other thing I was thinking about was kind of on the topic of like swingy states and voters, is that I feel like a lot of people forget or don't know that close to 1/3 of the population are actually independent voters or consider themselves moderate voters, and that as reporters and journalists, we're talking to them, we're talking to Republicans, we're talking to Democrats, and how that influences the way that you're covering things, especially when Trump dominates so much of the news coverage. Are there any stories where you guys feel like maybe that influenced the way you were telling the story, or kind of how you think about that when you're covering politics?
I mean, we think a lot about making sure that we feel fair to all different points of view. I think one of the things that people have really responded to about the reporting that we do is that we're not anti-Trump, we're not pro-Trump, we're trying to explain what's going on without taking a side. So I think if we're speaking to anybody, hopefully we're speaking to all sides. But I don't think, we haven't done anything specifically thinking about independence. I think probably that'll ramp up more for 2020 as that becomes more of an issue.
I will say from a data perspective, we did a lot of work and kind of pinpointing districts that flipped from Romney to Clinton, from Obama to Trump, things like that, to kind of identify these like elastic or flexible swingy districts. Not stuff that I personally worked on, but I've done a lot of the data analysis side, not so much the reporting, but kind of like the abstract data parts, yeah.
And so another thing that I was interested in, and I think, Maggie, I saw an article you had done on this, is election security, which is not something that I feel like gets covered a lot because it's kind of a hypothetical. But there's the actual physical election security of our electronic systems, and then there's what we saw in the 2016 election with Facebook and Twitter and kind of all the ways that we're influenced that maybe voters don't realize they're being influenced. How do you guys think about kind of covering, you know, like internet hoaxes, extremists? Because I know in our newsroom we have a lot of conversations about not wanting to give people platforms, but knowing that there's important stories that we have to cover that are kind of on the fringes of the political discussion. How do you guys think about that?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is that we have so many conversations, we talk so much, we obsess in newsrooms, at least at the Times, about whether and how to cover the hoaxes, the extremists, and we don't always get it right. And we also know that no matter which way we go, we are going to get blasted for it from one side or the other, which does not mean that there isn't a right answer or that you know, we can't make a right or wrong choice. But you know, I think that there is a perception among some readers that we write these stories almost cavalierly, like we just start out assuming they're news and we're going to write about them. We lose sleep over, you know, questioning, do we write about this white supremacist? You know, if we write about him, are we giving him a platform, or are we shining a light on a really dark portion of society that is becoming more influential? And so I think that the tack we've tried to take, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, is not to write about these things straight, for lack of a better word, but to frame it in the sense of debunking disinformation. And, you know, it's all in the framing of the story. I don't think it's a black and white choice of do we write about it or do we not. And so we're constantly trying to strike the right balance, because the fact that white supremacy and other forms of extremism are becoming more accepted in certain parts of the country, and the fact that the president is actively encouraging and courting some of these groups, that is absolutely something that needs to be exposed, but we need to figure out a way to do it that doesn't, you know, play into that phenomenon. And I think that's an incredibly difficult balance to strike. And I'm certainly interested in anybody else's thoughts on the best way to do it, because I don't really know.
Well, I think that goes back to your question about sides in part. I mean, we're having a lot of conversations in our newsroom these days about, like, what does it mean to be biased if a bias is anti-white supremacist, for example. So you have to be really, I mean, really, in season 2, actually, of the United States of Anxiety, we did a story about someone who created the other side of the climate change debate, which was a thing that was manufactured by consultants and people. So now when somebody reports a story on a scientific fact, you have to have the other side. And we want to stay away from those pitfalls when it comes to things like white supremacy. We had a moment in our reporting this season where we did a story about a woman who was trying to put up suffrage memorials all over the state of Tennessee to mark Tennessee's very pivotal role in getting the 19th Amendment ratified. And one of the parks that she had singled out for her monuments was a Confederate park. It had statues of Confederate generals. It had some cannons that were actually not Confederate cannons, but there was lore around maybe they were. So one day I found myself writing an email to the Sons of the Confederate Veterans about their take on this story, and Kai and I kind of looked at each other and we were like, you know what, no, this isn't the story. And so you do have to make those choices. You don't want to go down rabbit holes just because they're there. You want to like have a good head on your shoulders editorially.
I would say for us it's sort of similar. Like, Fact Checker obviously wades into sort of mythology and internet conspiracy and all of that kind of stuff from time to time, and it's about when it sort of passes a certain bar. So after the 2016 election, for example, a lot of people started emailing Glenn, our editor, saying that they didn't vote for Clinton because the Clinton Foundation had paid for Chelsea's wedding. And there was so many people who like truly believed this that he was like, okay, I'm gonna like report this out. And so he spent a couple days or whatever like getting all of the details and getting all of the receipts and essentially, you know, proving that they didn't. So when it comes to a point where there's sort of like a cultural precipice, then that's when we wade in.
So another question I had for you guys is what it's like to be a woman covering politics. And that's also about what it's like to be a woman kind of in the public space, but especially covering politics and using social media. What have your experiences been like with that, and how do you think about it, I guess?
I don't know. I mean, I definitely had weird days where like I'd get catcalled on the street on my way into the office to go report my like gender and power story, which was frustrating, but realistic. I don't know if anybody else.
This has less to do, I think, with my like public persona, but more what it's like to be a person in the newsroom who is young and a woman when there aren't that many of us. I think 2016 introduced a lot of scenarios that I never would have imagined I would have talked about at work, like confronting my 50-year-old male bosses about why we needed to say the word pussy on the air. And this was like a serious debate because it was this Access Hollywood recording, because I was at NPR at the time, because we are not supposed to put vile language on the air. I was being told that we needed to bleep the word. And I think everybody in this room knows that there's a very specific difference between that word and another word and another word and another word. Like, the use of that word felt really important to me. And my bosses didn't really get that. And it was really hard to be one of the only people who was trying to express why this was important. And it's a longer story, but the end of the story is, they made me bleep it, and now, on my new show, we play it all the time.
I think I've heard that on your podcast, actually.
On a similar note to that, actually, regarding the same Access Hollywood tape, when that came out, I was not a reporter. I was still on the copy desk, but I was editing campaign coverage, and the sheer number of times in the days that followed that tape that I would get an article to edit, and it would say something like, you know, an Access Hollywood tape in which Donald Trump spoke crudely about women. And this made me want to scream, because there were so many people in the newsroom who I thought were smarter than this, who were treating this tape as though the problem were that he said the word pussy, which is obviously part of it, but and the arguments I had to go through to get people to write in their articles that the president boasted about grabbing women's genitals, or even harder, the president boasted about sexual assault. And just these words, the framing of it, there's definitely, there are definitely perspectives that I have as a woman and that other women in the newsroom have that seem so obvious.
Right.
And yet the men in the newsroom.
That's the thing about it. It seems so obvious
Yeah.
that it's hard to explain.
Exactly. It feels like it should be self-explanatory.
But it makes me so glad you were there. And that you did that.
Sometimes I won and sometimes I
Yeah.
didn't. But in response to the other portion of your question, which was about being a woman on social media, I do not get as much of the crap on social media as a lot of other female reporters do. And I sort of dread a day when, like, I might come to certain people's attention and start getting that. But, but what I do get are a lot of the same, snarky emails that any reporter, man or woman will get, but written in very gendered terms. So for example, my author page on the Times website says that I'm a Barnard alum. And so I got an email from one reader who read one of my articles and wrote to me asking if I took any real classes at Barnard or if I just studied women's studies. And
That's a deep cut.
Yeah, that's rough.
And there's so much to unpack there. And then, this same reader also saw my Twitter bio, which mentions that I like cats, and got into the whole, well, maybe you should have spent more time studying and less time with your cats. And when I'm saying all this because when I first started reporting on politics, it really, really bothered me. And I knew that I shouldn't let it bother me, but it did. And so I think the conclusion I've come to is that, I should be bothered by that stuff. It's not fun to be bothered by it. It would be easier if I could just brush it off, but I shouldn't be okay with it. I shouldn't get used to it. So again, my experiences in that area have been nothing like what, Maggie Haberman or some of the other female reporters get, but it's definitely a reality, and you definitely get messages that, frankly, naively, I did not think that I would get in this day and age.
Yeah, I think for me, I also get quite a good amount of gendered spam. The thing that was most striking actually was from 2016 when I was in the field much more often. And at the time I was usually a photographer, so you're carrying 60 pounds of whatever. And just the way that older men felt like it was totally okay to yell at you or try to grab you or whatever, I was sort of shocked by, because I was clearly I'm an adult and I'm a professional, leave me alone, what's your problem? But alas, here we are.
Yeah, I had an interesting moment once when an older man did not realize that his mic was hot while I was getting the camera set. So yeah, it's definitely interesting. One of the other questions I had was kind of we touched on when talking about being a woman in the newsroom, but diversity in the newsroom. And I think a lot of people kind of outside of journalism maybe don't realize how many different voices go into a story, even if there's only one name on the byline, just talking through it, talking through the original idea, coming up with the framing, the concept, the editing. Can you guys talk a little bit about journalists, just about kind of that, I guess, the impact of your colleagues and how diversity is important there?
I can talk a little bit. For one, I think that a lot of the work I do is especially collaborative because I work on graphics and I don't do a whole lot of traditional reporting. So from idea generation to final product, there are a lot of people working with me and that I work with. I work with reporters who maybe they found a data set and they need ideas about how to visualize it. So I might work with one person, or I might work with them and their editor, and then a copy editor, and maybe a graphics editor if it's a bigger piece. So there'll be at least 5 people working on one story just to have a few words and a graphic. We just have a lot of collaboration in that sense. And I'll say that I feel like more eyes and ideas on any story is better than fewer. I think that I can't think of a newsroom that doesn't need to do better in terms of diversity, both in terms of race and also in terms of class and economic experience and status. I feel like diverse voices across different dimensions are incredibly important in journalism, and there aren't enough voices being kind of heard and magnified. Also, I think that it's important for editors and managers and people in positions of power to be able to support those voices. And if you have kind of diverse voices in your newsroom, it's hard for managers and editors to also understand the needs of different people and different types of work that is being done. So yeah, but a lot of my work is collaborative.
I think that, as Rachael said, there really isn't a newsroom on the planet that is in the place it should be with regard to diversity, both in terms of the people who actually work in the newsroom and in terms of the tone of coverage. But I think what I have seen lately, at least at the Times, that is heartening, is a bit more of an awareness of the blind spots that are there. So, for example, at the Times we work a lot in Slack, and we have a Slack channel that's just called Diversity. And sometimes this channel is used for us to criticize some of our own coverage that we feel missed the mark. But lately, something that's been happening in there that I love is people will post, I'm writing this article about, a state considering allowing a non-binary option on driver's licenses. Can someone please read the draft to make sure that we didn't inadvertently fall into any, offensive language or, gaps or stereotypes or whatever. And then I've seen people actually listening to the feedback that they get in that respect and actually revising the article before it's published to address some of these concerns that they wouldn't have thought of on their own. And of course, this only works if you have enough people in the newsroom who have the personal experience in these various areas. But I think that it's a really hopeful sign, at least for me, that people are recognizing the need to seek the input of people who have actually had the experiences that you're writing about and really take their feedback into account.
Great. And kind of going off diversity a little bit, which is a question I skipped over that I meant to ask before, is about young voters. This is the Young Alumni panel, and so I know that young voters got a lot of attention in these midterms, and we saw them turn out in higher numbers. Maggie, I know you did a little reporting on gun violence and how that might have motivated people, and I think, Rachael, we talked about some of the data analysis you'd done. Are there any stories that you guys looked at, the motivations behind young voters or the role they were playing in this midterms that might have been different from before?
I think gun violence was a huge motivating factor. One of the first stories that I did for Politics was I spent a few days with the Parkland students on their summer bus tour. And one of the things that just leaped out at me on this tour was how terrified every school-age student in this country is right now. And, I graduated high school in 2007. it was long after Columbine we understood that school shootings were a thing that happened, but every single student I spoke to talked about every single day they walk into their school and they are scared that that will be the day their school is shot up. I talked to students, dozens and dozens of students, who actually, when they enter a classroom, they think about where they're going to sit in the classroom in relation to the exits, in relation to the closets. And not just that students think about these things, but the way in which it is a constant presence in their lives in a way that it wasn't for me, less than 15 years ago, is really, it's extraordinary. And I think that experience, that existential threat, was an enormous motivating factor for young voters, for people who are in school just turning 18, voting for the first time, for people who maybe have younger siblings who are, in school. It has suddenly, there have always been public policy issues that deeply affect young people, but young people did not always realize how much those issues affected them. And I think gun violence is such a personal issue and has become such a ubiquitous threat that it's impossible for young voters not to understand how the policy affects their life. And we certainly did see higher turnout among young voters, and gun violence certainly wasn't the only factor in that, but I think it was a very, very large factor.
I think it's interesting that young people also seem to feel that politics and activism is much more accessible than I think I did when I was in high school, and I think it's partially social media and a lot of the ways we've seen it be used. But I talked to a 21-year-old woman in New York who is running for state assembly, who's a Republican, and she said that Donald Trump motivated her to run because he didn't have any experience, and so that showed that anyone could run. Which I thought was really interesting. So what do you guys see looking at kind of this younger generation and how they talk about politics and how they think about politics? We're seeing it now with the new class of congressmen coming in, how they use social media to kind of lift the veil of what's happening. What do you guys think about that? I'm interested to hear.
We've got a new project going where we're hoping to follow one person from the freshman class throughout the next kind of year and maybe onward. I think one of the things that you see on the Instagram feeds of like Ocasio-Cortez or Ayanna Pressley or Rashida Tlaib is I think they're trying really hard to make it more accessible to people. And so what we're hoping to do is to follow somebody through that process, because Cassie, you probably know this really well, like people come in and they're so excited and everything's gonna be different and I'm gonna make the change, look at me. And then, 6 months rolls around and guess what? They have to run again. They have to make more calls to their donors. And you know what? Actually, the Democratic caucus isn't that excited about your idea. And oh, shoot. So we're hoping to, I'm not saying that's going to happen, okay? I'm not like making this like pessimistic prediction, but I think that's something that we're interested in exploring for sure, is what do you do when you come in and you want to be a change maker and you're young and you maybe don't have experience and you're following in that kind of Trump model, like you're going to come in and make a difference. Like, how does that actually play out? We're trying really hard to figure out how to do that and who is like a really good character for us. But we're also really excited about this new, these young women who are coming in who are trying to expose the process. Like if you just follow these people on Instagram, it's really fun to just watch them walk down the halls and like get excited about stuff and not be like this
the free snacks.
Yeah, and not be just this like buttoned up kind of like, well, yes, I'm a representative now, so.
Like they went on a bus tour of the Capitol and it was like so cute.
Yeah,
to see all the
yeah,
congressmen.
it's really fun.
Everyone should follow them on Instagram and everything. So my last question for all of you guys is, and I should have asked you guys to all say your majors when you were introducing yourself, is about how Barnard helped you or prepared you for your career. I was an anthropology major, which when I first went in for job interviews, got like some blank stares, but I actually think that it's super related to my career, and I'm really thankful that that's what I studied. It really helped me kind of wrap my head around how to understand people and why I'm so fascinated by people and understanding them. So.
I was an architecture major and a South Asia studies minor. So yeah, but but I think that actually architecture really helped me understand how to take apart big problems into smaller pieces. And I also think in terms of making visuals, which is a big part of my job and has always been a sort of thread through my very twisty career, it taught me all of the core basic skills and how to sort of see in terms of pictures and light and color, and how to structure a story in the way that you think about moving through a building, so those sort of spaces.
I was a religion major, so also some blank stares, but I think that being a religion major gets you really, it's like a thinky, righty major, and that's the kind of show I work on now. But also religion is really a part of every politics story, I think. It's a part of our American culture in so many ways, whether overt or not. And it also gets you thinking about sort of like those background things in the brain that might be dictating a person's behavior, which again is sort of what I think about all the time now.
I was a political science major, so pretty directly related. But I think actually there's one specific class that really helped me, which was one of my junior year colloquium with Professor Manitti on social movements. And I learned so much in that class about not just the history of social movements, but how they develop, what separates the ones that are successful from the ones that fade out. And I have found, I actually still have my notes from that class, and there have actually been times in the past few months where I have gone back to my notes from that class when writing about things like the Parkland students. I was trying to sort of assess as best as it's possible to do at this point, are they going to be, is this movement going to be sustainable? Is this going to be different from the gun control movements that faded out before? And I've also been doing a project all year about the 50th anniversary of 1968 and the parallels between 1968 and today. And I think the framework from that one class of social movements and social activism has just been extraordinarily helpful to me for one single class that I took in college.
Wow. That's awesome. Yeah. I was an American Studies major, which I think what all y'all have said, that it lets you learn how to think and read critically and think critically and ask important questions and question narratives, form narratives. But for me, I actually think the biggest thing Barnard did for me was, I was thinking about this, I told Elise this story, I remember really distinctly when I was a junior at Barnard, I went to a panel like this. It was about media and communications and something. And this woman was up there and she had worked at Morning Edition. And she had gone to Barnard and I was at Barnard and I was sitting there, but she was sitting here. And so we weren't that different. And I realized, oh, I could do that. And that feeling is so unique to this place. And I think is what motivates us to do what we do, and so that's the biggest thing I think Barnard gave me, as well as like the friendships of my life and the friends who have, yeah, they're awesome right there. No, like the work that we do is really hard, and it's hard to keep going all the time, and yeah, having my Barnard friends to support me in that is the best thing that Barnard gave me.
One, I also took that social movements class, and I think about it all the time. Because there was a huge component of it that was about media coverage of social movements, and I still have all the books, and I think about it all the time.
Is Professor Manitti around
you
here?
guys,
I wanted that.
You need to tell her.
But I majored in urban studies and architecture. And I think that I originally always planned to work in urban planning, and that's why I was at the MTA in transportation planning. But I think they influence a lot of what I do because, one, I was kind of had a really technical focus in my major, so I did a lot of mapping. That's kind of what I focused on in my undergrad. In urban studies really let me do that, and I took a lot of kind of mathier classes for architecture, and the studio courses I feel like really helped me with, because my job is really graphics heavy and I do a lot of visual things. I feel like a lot of that directly relates to what I do. I think that I also worked at the Empirical Reasoning Center at Barnard, and that basically influenced a lot of what I kind of learned how to do. I learned how to program there as I worked there, and I think that it as a resource, and I still go back all the time to just like talk to students and to also like help them with their workshops, and also to like talk to the fellows that work there. I think that the Empirical Reasoning Center really like grounded my kind of analytical and tech-y kind of work that I do. So I feel like that part of Barnard really influenced what skills I had and the confidence that I had to kind of take on more technical jobs and do more things that, I don't have a software development background, but I do work on a lot of more programming heavy projects in journalism. And I feel like those courses and the Empirical Reasoning Center like really supported my feeling that I actually belonged in those spaces. So, yeah.
Cool.